All right, welcome back. So we are in Numbers chapter 4. So when we jump into Numbers chapter 4, what we learn is the responsibilities of Aaron and his sons and also the descendants of Levi. So we learn that Kohath is in charge of the vessels of the sanctuary. We learn that Gershon is in charge of all the things related to the outer tabernacle, the curtains, and all of those things. And we learn that the sons of Merari are in charge of all the boards and the pillars of the tabernacle. In chapter 5, Israel learns the requirements and what to do if somebody has been defiled or declared unclean. We also see a very interesting process if there is any jealousy between a husband and a wife. So if the husband is jealous and believes that his wife has been unfaithful, he takes her to the tabernacle, they bring what they need for an offering, and then the priest makes a bitter water. And if she is unfaithful to her husband, when she drinks the bitter water, her stomach will swell and her thigh will rot. If she is not unfaithful to her husband, after drinking this bitter water, they will bear children. So that is a very interesting process for how husbands deal with jealousy of their wives. In chapter 6, these are the laws regarding a Nazirite. So if you take a Nazirite vow, you are not allowed to cut your hair, you're not allowed to drink wine or anything that comes from the vine tree, and you are not allowed to come in contact with any dead body. You can't even become unclean for loved ones. And this Nazirite vow was actually a temporary vow. This is different than what we'll see when we get to the story of Samson. So Samson was born a Nazirite. So this was a lifelong requirement for his lifestyle. But this Nazirite vow could be something temporary that the Israelites did. And something that stood out to me about chapter 7 was that the word separate or some form of separation is mentioned in this chapter, I think about 8 times. And this is important even in the church age. So this was just not something that was important for Israel because they're holy and supposed to be God's set apart nation. But this can be important for us in the church age as well. We should be separate. We should be in the world, but not of the world. We should look different than the world, the way we carry ourselves. So I thought that was really important. Something else that stood out was verses 24 through 27 in this chapter. If you have heard the song, The Blessing, I believe it's by Elevation Worship, this is where it came from. So verse 24 through 27 says, "The Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace. And they shall put my name upon the children of Israel, and I will bless them." So this song, The Blessing, even though Christians sing it now, this is actually about the blessings on the children of Israel. So again, pretty cool. We'll see a lot of songs that we're all familiar with, specifically in the book of Psalms, but it's pretty cool to see a song that a lot of people are familiar with came from this chapter. In chapter 7, we see that when the sons of Kohath are transporting the things of the tabernacle, unlike Gershon and Merari, they are not allowed to carry these items on a cart or oxen. They have to bear them on their shoulders. So that is specified and spelled out for them very clearly in this chapter. We also see the specific order and the days that the princes of Israel were supposed to carry out their different offerings. In chapter 8, we see how the Levites are to be cleansed or purified. So a water is to be sprinkled on them. They're supposed to shave, cleanse their bodies, wash their clothes, and then the Levites are required to make offerings. And we see that God says that while up until this point he has made it very clear that he wants the first of everything, the firstborn, he is declaring that Levi, or the tribe of Levi, is going to be like his firstborn, his chosen possession out of all the tribes of Israel. And we also see that there are age limits for the service of the Levites. So they are only supposed to do the service between the ages of 25 and 50. In chapter 9, we see the rules about the Passover and the exceptions that can be made if somebody comes in contact with a dead body or you're on a long journey. Instead of celebrating the Passover on that specific date that's been declared for all of Israel, these two groups of people, if you have come in contact with a dead body or you are on a long journey, you will celebrate the Passover the following month on the same day. We also see the cloud over the tabernacle, or the pillar of fire over the tabernacle. This is how Israel knew when God wanted them to move. So if the cloud or the pillar of fire moved, they knew they had to move with God out of Sinai. If the cloud stayed in place, then Israel knew they were supposed to settle. So this was God's way of ordering Israel's steps. And we see this mentioning of ordering steps in Psalm 119, verse 133, another verse that a song has been made from. It says, order my steps in thy word, and let not any iniquity have dominion over me. So God was ordering the steps of Israel by giving him these visual things to follow as they leave Mount Sinai. In chapter 10, God tells Moses to make trumpets, and depending on how he sounds the alarm or how he blows the trumpet, Israel knew that they were supposed to do a certain thing. So he was either calling all the people to come and gather at the door of the tabernacle, or he was calling the priests to come to him so that they could lead the people of Israel. He may have been telling them to go forward and fight, or they blew the trumpet over their burnt offerings or peace offerings. So the trumpets have multiple uses. And then in this chapter, we see that the people move from Sinai to Paran as they're following the cloud, and Moses tries to get his in-laws to come with them because he's like, if God's favor is on us, you are going to reap the benefits of that favor if you're with us. But his in-laws say that they want to go where they want to go, so they don't go with them. Then when we get to chapter 11, we see that Israel is once again engaged in their favorite pastime, complaining. This time they are actually comparing their time in the wilderness being with God with being in bondage in Egypt, because the food was better. They had a better experience there according to them, and this enraged God. So he consumed some of the people with fire. And we can actually compare this with 1 Corinthians chapter 10 if we look at verses 5 and 6. So verse 5 says, but with many of them God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things were our examples, to the intent we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. So again, I've spoken about this before. The behavior of the Israelites in the Old Testament, while it can seem really frustrating or annoying to read them over and over again disobeying God, this is the same thing that we do. And we're able to see this as an example for us of what not to do. This is the perfect example of what not to do. We should not be complaining over and over again because our past made us more comfortable. It felt better than being in this difficult season. Even though we're close and in close intimacy with God, this new journey is difficult and we don't really know what's going to happen, but we knew what to expect in the old life. But coming here in this journey to this new place where God is taking us, it can be really scary. So we have to caution ourselves by looking at the example of Israel. Do not mumble and complain while you're on this journey with God. Be grateful that he's with you in the wilderness. Then in verse 11, for the first time, we actually see Moses complain. So verse 11 says, and Moses said unto the Lord, wherefore hast thou afflicted thy servant? And wherefore have I not found favor in thy sight, that thou layest the burden of all this people upon me? So Moses is overwhelmed. He's like, I didn't give birth to these people. These are not my people. How am I supposed to carry all of this burden? And God says that he will now delegate to these people that Moses selects. He will give his spirit that he put on Moses and give that spirit to these people so they can help bear the burden with Moses, so he won't be as overwhelmed anymore. Then we get to see a little bit of God's pettiness, which I think is hilarious, because we often think of these human emotions we have, jealousy, pettiness, all of these things. We see God show jealousy. We see a little bit of pettiness in this chapter. So the people are complaining because they're like, look, all we have to eat is this manna. We had meat when we were in Egypt, and God is like, oh, you want meat? Okay, I'm gonna give you so much meat, you're gonna be sick of it. It's gonna be coming out of your nostrils. The sarcasm, the pettiness of it all. Hilarious. So Moses even gets some of that petty energy from God as well, because Moses is like, okay, where are you going to get enough meat to feed all of these people? This is in verses 21 through 23. So it says, and Moses said, the people among whom I am are 600,000 footmen, and thou hast said, I will give them flesh that they may eat a whole month. Shall the flocks and the herds be slain for them to suffice them? Or shall all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them to suffice them? And the Lord said unto Moses, is the Lord's hand waxed short? Thou shalt see now whether my word shall come to pass unto thee or not. So the Lord is like, who are you talking to? I'm him. So if I say I'm going to give them enough meat to make them sick, I'm going to do it. So very funny to see the character, the personality of God, even though in this sense is not really a good reason for him to be a little petty or to have some sarcasm, but very interesting to see more of God's personality. And then by verse 31, God did exactly what he said he would do. It says, and there went forth a wind from the Lord and brought quails from the sea, and let them fall by the camp, as it were a day's journey on this side, and as it were a day's journey on the other side, round about the camp, and as it were 2 cubits high upon the face of the earth. If I'm not mistaken, I believe a cubit is about 18 inches. So this is somewhere around 3 feet worth of quail stacked up in the camp, because God said, yeah, I'm gonna give you what you want. And because God is frustrated with Israel, he does send a plague to move throughout the camp. Next, in chapter 12, we see that Miriam and Aaron are actually jealous of their brother. So they claim to be upset because Moses has an Ethiopian wife, but really once you see what they're getting at, they're really just saying in verse 2, hath the Lord indeed spoken only by Moses? Hath he not spoken also by us, and the Lord heard it? So they're like, why is Moses so special? God has spoken to us too. So God hears what they're saying, obviously, and Moses in his meekness has no response. So God is like, once again, I'll take care of it. So Miriam becomes leprous. And once Aaron sees that, he immediately acknowledges his sin. He repents. Moses intercedes for them. So God spares the life of Miriam and Aaron. And Miriam just has to stay outside of the camp for 7 days because, again, we just read all those laws about leprosy. She is considered unclean. So she stays outside of the camp for 7 days. Then in verse 13, Moses sends a man from each of the tribes to spy out the land of Canaan, which is going to be their promised land. And he wants a full report. What is the land like? Is it good or bad? What are the inhabitants like? Is this going to be a good place for us to go? Pretty much Moses wants the full report. When the spies come back, majority of them give an evil report. Caleb is like, I don't know what y'all are talking about. This is a land flowing with milk and honey. Let's go in there now. Let's conquer these people now. Let's take this land as our possession. So once again, Israel starts talking as if God has made some kind of mistake. They're like, look, you brought us all the way out here just to kill us. Like, this was a mistake. We should have just stayed in Egypt. And Caleb and Joshua are the only two that are like, look, this is not a problem. We have God on our side. He will make these people bread for us. We can conquer them when God is on our side. It's going to be a victory. And the people are so frustrated with them in their fear of what the inhabitants of this land look like because they're giants. So they're like, we cannot take them. They are too big for us. They're ready to stone Joshua and Caleb because they're like, look, y'all gotta shut up. You're not about to get us killed. So as a consequence of their faithless report to Moses, well, the majority of the people's faithless report to Moses, God says anybody 20 years old and up is not going to be allowed to go into the promised land. Like, you think that I'm not big enough to do this for you, so you just can't have it. So this is devastating for the people, but this is the consequence of their faithless report. He says Joshua and Caleb will be able to go, but not the rest of you. He also says, because the spies spied out the land for 40 days, you will wander in the wilderness for 40 years. So it will be 40 years before they're even able to get into the promised land now. It's right there. They already saw it. They already experienced the goodness of the fruit there. And Joshua and Caleb were confident God would be able to defeat their enemies and they will possess the land. But God says, no, it will be another 40 years now because of your lack of faith in me. So because this is devastating and they're like, no, please don't take away this promise, the people try to enter the land by themselves. They're like, look, God, we're being obedient now. We'll do it now. So they go by themselves without God, without the Ark of the Testimony, without Moses. They tried to go into the land and conquer it by themselves. But because they were not with God, their fear actually came true. They were annihilated because God was not with them. But if they would have went when he told them to and he was in their presence, they would have defeated their enemies. Next, as we go into chapters 15 through 20, what's important to acknowledge about these chapters is that we are seeing the dying off of that first generation because God said they would not enter the promised land. So we're seeing over these next few chapters that generation dying off, this new generation coming of age to really understand and learn the law. So we're going to see a lot of repetition because the laws now have to be explained to this new generation. So in chapter 15, we get an explanation of all the laws and how even the strangers in the land have to make offerings and sacrifices and abide by the law the same way the Israelites do. If you're going to be in this land, you have to follow the same rules as everybody else. We also see a conversation or an explanation of the different types of sin. So if you are sinning unknowingly versus sinning with intention, what the different consequences are and what you have to do to atone for these types of sins. Then in chapter 16, there's another rebellion or a type of jealousy against Moses and Aaron. So Korah leads a rebellion with Dathan and Abiram. And he says, look, this whole congregation is holy. But Moses and Aaron are elevating themselves above everybody else as if they're more special, which actually is not true. They were chosen by God. They did not elevate themselves. And if we can remember, Moses didn't even want this position of power. He was like, look, I'm slow of speech. I cannot be in charge of this. I can't talk to Pharaoh. I can't lead these people. So Korah is completely misguided in what he's saying and what his accusations are. And because God is upset about this, Moses says, look, God will make it abundantly clear to you who he has chosen and who he has not chosen. So we see that God tells Moses to tell everyone to separate themselves from the families of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. And he says, God, if he has actually chosen us, he's going to do a new thing. You won't die a natural death if God has actually chosen us. If we are holy, you won't die a natural death. God is going to do a new thing and open up the earth and consume you. And that's exactly what happens. Moses told everybody to step back, and the earth opened up and consumed Korah, Dathan, and Abiram and all of their families, all of their possessions alive. They fell into a pit of the earth. And after this, the people still don't get it. Instead of just acknowledging that God is holy and he has chosen Moses and Aaron to speak to him and speak on his behalf, the people are like, now you killed all these people. You're still the problem. And God is upset again. So he sends a plague throughout the congregation. Moses and Aaron intercede. Aaron sends incense throughout the congregation to try to stop the plague from spreading, but not before 14,700 people died. Then in chapter 17, God proves that he chose Aaron by allowing his staff or his rod to bloom and blossom with almonds, while the other rods of the other 11 leaders of the tribes, their rods did not blossom. So Aaron's rod was a symbol, and it was sat before the Ark of the Testimony. Then in chapter 18, we see more of the differences between Aaron and his sons versus the rest of the priests in Israel. So whenever there was an offering made, a tenth was given to the priests, Aaron and his sons. So whenever they received a tithe, they would make a heave offering and give a tenth part to the Lord. The rest was to go to their household. Another difference is that when they get to the promised land, the Levites won't have an inheritance. They won't have a portion of land that is specifically theirs because God is their inheritance. So they will get a tithe from Israel. They will be taken care of by the other tribes, but they won't have a specific possession or parcel of land that belongs to them. In chapter 19, we see the laws about purification for sin. So if you become unclean, these are the rules about how you can purify yourself and become clean again. In chapter 19, we see that Miriam passes away, so she dies in Kadesh. And even though this is a brand new generation of people, we see that they actually learn from their parents to mumble and complain. So they begin complaining again because they have no water. And this is the part where I told us to remember. So we see that God actually told Moses to take his rod and speak to the rock. But instead, Moses did the exact same thing he did before. He smote the rock. But God specifically said, speak to the rock this time. Do not hit the rock. So Moses was disobedient. So if we go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, if we look at verse 4, we can see why this was a problem for God, why he was not supposed to hit the rock. So it says, and did all drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. So Moses hit Christ essentially when he hit this rock in Numbers. So in Exodus, when Moses hit the rock, he was supposed to because Christ was struck at Calvary. But when he was supposed to speak to the rock, this was supposed to be a representation of after Calvary. Now we pray, we speak to Jesus through this communication of prayer. So another pretty cool picture of being able to see Jesus, or pictures of Jesus in the Old Testament. So as we continue in this chapter, we see that Israel seeks safe passage through the Edomites. And if we can remember, Esau was actually the father of the Edomites. So the same way that Jacob became Israel and is the father of the Israelites, Edom is from Esau, and they are the descendants. So this is their brother nation who they're asking for safe passage through, and they are denied. And then to wrap up this chapter, we see that Aaron passes away, but Eleazar becomes the new high priest. Then in chapter 21, we get to see another pattern. So we've seen Israel continue to murmur and complain. Now this time we are going to start to see that now they are asking God for help. He delivers them. They start to complain. He punishes them. After he punishes them, they ask Moses, please intercede on our behalf. God is gracious to forgive them, and then the cycle starts all over again. So in this chapter, God is upset with them because they are murmuring and complaining again. And because they're murmuring and complaining, God sends a fiery serpent throughout the congregation. The serpent is biting the people are dying, and Moses is told to create a brass serpent and put it on a pole. So anybody that looks to that brass serpent will be healed. So if we turn to John chapter 3 verses 13 and 14, we can see that this brass serpent that Moses made was another Old Testament picture of Jesus Christ. So Verse 13 says, "And no man hath ascended up to heaven, but he that came down from heaven, even the Son of Man which is in heaven. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up." Then we can turn to chapter 12, verse 32, which says, "And I, if I be lifted up from the earth, I will draw all men unto me." So again, another cool picture of Jesus Christ in the Old Testament. Then at the end of this chapter, they go on to defeat the Amorites and they defeat Bashan. Then we get to see some very supernatural happenings in chapter 22. So in chapter 22, we see that Balak summons Balaam. He wants Balaam to curse Israel because he's heard about all of their victories and he does not want them to defeat his nation. So he's like, look, curse these people so that we will defeat them in war. Balaam seeks the counsel of God, and God says, do not go with Balak's people. Don't go with them because you're not going to curse Israel. And the people summon him again, and he speaks with God, and God says, okay, if they come back, then you can go with them. But right after that, instead of Balaam waiting for them to come back to summon him, he just gets up and goes. And we see that God's anger is kindled towards him. So if you just read through this really quickly, you might say, okay, why is God upset? Because God said if they come back, you can go. But Balaam initiates this journey. He goes off by himself because they did not come back again to summon him. So he just went by himself. And this is why God's anger is kindled against him. Then something supernatural happens. And this is not the movie Shrek, but there is a talking donkey. So as Balaam is journeying, his donkey stops and it does not move because his donkey can see the angel of the Lord standing in the way. So he's whipping the donkey, being upset with the donkey because it's being obstinate. It's not moving when he wants it to move. So God allows the donkey to speak. And the donkey says, why do you keep hitting me? And Balaam is like, you're not listening to me. Like, why aren't you moving? So a donkey is talking. Balaam doesn't seem surprised or shocked at all, which is amazing to me because I would lose my mind. But yeah, so the donkey can see the angel of the Lord standing in the way. So after Balaam has this conversation with his donkey, God opens Balaam's eyes and he's able to see the angel of the Lord. And the angel of the Lord is like, look, your donkey saved your life because if you would have kept coming, I would have killed you. But the angel of the Lord eventually gives him safe passage and he says, look, you can go. But when you go, you can only say what God tells you to say. In chapter 23, Balaam meets with God and he gives him the words to say. He blesses Israel instead of cursing them, and this enrages Balak. And Balaam is like, look, I can only say what God tells me to say. I already told you that. And I think this is awesome that God is still protecting his people. We've seen how obstinate and disobedient and annoying they have been, but God is like, these are still my people. I'm protecting them. They are not going to be cursed. They will be blessed. In chapter 24, the same thing continues. Israel is blessed and favored by God, and Balak is just angry about this. So that is Numbers chapter 4 through 24. Lord willing, I will see you all next week. Grace and peace.